Let me welcome you and thank you for participating in this second session of our Church at Home Lent 2019 season. This week, of course, we turn to the probably most infamous and greatest parable of certainly of Luke's Gospel, the 15th chapter, and we call it the Prodigal Son. That's its popular name. I'd like to suggest to you today, though, that maybe the central feature of this parable is not the son, not the prodigal son, it's not the older brother, it's not even the father himself. The feature of this parable that I'd like to call to your attention and maybe reflect with you a bit about is the great mercy of the Father. So this is kind of, as we did with the fig tree and the master and the gardener and the fig tree itself, I think we have some opportunity to consider the image of the merciful Father or the mercy of the Father in this great parable. Last week we were considering the great and unconditional love of God and our call to be patient, like the gardener. And in that patience we can offer assistance and help to others in their attempt to bear fruit in the world. So that great unconditional love of God and our call to share that unconditional love of God, self-sacrificing love for the sake of the other. What we might learn from the parable today of the merciful father or the prodigal son is that this unconditional love of God and this patient extension of the love of God in the world comes to us through the gateway and the grace of mercy. You know, the word mercy in Latin is misericordia. It is the suffering heart. Mercy. And what we learn from the parable of the merciful Father is that it is the great mercy of the Father being applied to each of His sons. That reminds me of something Jay, my godson, said to me just recently in the wake of my mother's death only a few weeks ago. He was hailing my Mima's virtues, that's what we call her, Mima. And he said, you know what was really a great talent or a virtue of Mima is that she didn't practice the golden rule, she practiced the platinum rule. Well, I had to admit I had never heard of the platinum rule before. Of course, I'm familiar with the golden rule that we ought to treat others the way we would like to be treated. Jay, that's my godson, tells me that if he were to practice the golden rule in his life, that would not go very well for other people. You know, that would be kind of a limited way of reaching out to other people, because you're reaching out to other people the way you would like to be reached out to. What he says that my mother and he evidently are trying to practice in life is the platinum rule. I don't treat other people the way I want to be treated. I treat other people the way they need to be treated. What you see about the platinum rule is that it takes into consideration the heart of the person we are loving. It is an actual practice of self-sacrificing, those blinders of the horse, in our attempts to be loving, so that our love is pure. It is not self-referential. It's not about loving you the way I want to be treated. It is loving you the way you need to be treated, the way you need to be loved. In your particular circumstance, with your limitations, with your fears, with your gifts, with your blessings. I thought, wow, I think I should have heard about this before. I'm getting pretty long in the tooth to not have known about this. But I see this in the parable of the merciful Father, if you will. You know, the Father doesn't treat both of the sons the same way. What He does is He exercises mercy in both examples. because both of the sons needed a very different extension of mercy. That's a very tender lesson for all of us. If we want to successfully extend the mercy or the unconditional love of God from our hearts into the lives of others, we have got to consider carefully, through mercy, the circumstance, the tenderness, the particularities of the person we're dealing with. You know, I spent a lot of time in hospitals of late with my mom and her situation. And when I was by myself, I would oftentimes look into the faces of all these people and wonder, what agony are they going through? All of us here in these big hospitals and institutions, we are all lives and hearts that are broken and burdened by something completely independent of one another, if you will. And each of us needs to be addressed, if you will, as our particular and tender and personal situation. That's the way we could be loving. Seems to me that the great gospel parable of the merciful Father is encouraging each of us to apply unconditional love of God, self-sacrificing love for the sake of the other, with a real keen focus, or looking through the lens of mercy. If we could look at each person with this consideration of mercy, then they become the target, if you will. We can adapt our love that it might become apparent to them in the most effective way, in the most deliberate way, the most gentle way. I think that might be what we would call the patience of love. If we can slow down and consider the other person in their particular circumstance, I believe we might have a gateway to the unconditional love of God. So, as you are considering this week's gospel text and preparing for Sunday Mass, again, I'd like to ask you to think about one of those circumstances in which you have experienced impatience. And take another look, not only at what judgments were you making of that person that gave rise to the impatience, but what effect would mercy have on that situation if you had the patience to look tenderly into that heart in front of you and to consider again what they needed. Let's stop loving others the way we want to be loved, and let's start practicing the platinum rule. Let's start loving people the way they need to be loved. I think this would be a great act of mercy, and it would be a great fruit or expression of the unconditional love of God. God bless you.